friend David Cohen, one of my oldest friends in the world. We share Paris together, and if you were ever young and fortunate enough to live in Paris, you'll find it's a movable feast, said Hemingway. I wanted to thank Steve Pace tonight, particularly, and I wanted to mention something about the first time I went to Paris, alone with my parents. It was after I tried Indian food for the first time. We went to a little place in Greenwich Village. In fact, I walked by it yesterday. It's now called Taj Mahal. At the time, it was called A Taste of India. And it was the only Indian restaurant in Manhattan that I knew of anyway. There weren't many. It was back in the day when the Indians were kept out of immigrating to our beautiful country. So I was sitting there with my parents, and both of my brothers were in college. The eldest was in Cornell, and the middle brother had gone to Dartmouth. And finally I had my parents to myself, as I always wanted them. And I said, you know, it was so nice going to Paris when I was 10, but I don't really think I appreciated it. And I'd really like to go to Paris. And then we tasted the biryani, and it had the most incredible spice, which I later learned was cardamom. But I bit the whole seed and my mouth exploded in flavor like I've never experienced in my life. And the next day, a friend of my mother's called and said, you know, would you have any interest in spending about a month in Paris? My mom said, what are you talking about? And she said, the minister for the American Cathedral on the Avenue Georges V needs to spend about a month in New York. And I thought your house with the pool would be so beautiful for him. And you could stay in the rectory of the American Cathedral on the Avenue Georges V, next to the Seine. I mean, is that something you would be interested in doing? And my mother looked at me and she said, are you some kind of a witch? Later in high school, I was trying to finish the novel I started when I was 16 in Paris. And my friend David, who's sitting beside me, invited himself along on the trip. But this takes place about 10 years ago, when I finally got to go to Paris alone.
After my father died, I returned to living in the studio complex at the old Yale lock factory. I liked to tell friends I was going to graduate school at Yale. The factory hadn't made locks there since the 70s, when it moved manufacturing down south to avoid the unions before moving into China to avoid the government. And the Yale company lowered the smokestack several meters to mask their brand name. They took away the Y. It now said Ale. I liked that it was the first 3 letters of my name and one of my favorite beverages. It was good to be back with my paintings and the smell of oil paint, but everything else had changed, or was about to. It might have been a crack. It might have been meth. There was certainly some opiates involved and enough wine and weed to skew even the sanest asylum. I'd heard a rumor there was a large vat of mercury in the basement used in the electroplating process for the old brass door knob handle, the brass door handles. They just left the mercury vats there. I've heard that mercury can drive you nuts. Whatever the specific cause, the chemistry had gone off in Ale. What had been a more or less harmonious group of creative people split off into various tribes, sexual affairs, chemical romances, and psychological syndromes.
Hub, the bar. The patron was a pilot. He now worked for Air France, but in his younger years he'd flown a Mirage in the French Air Force, and he'd seen combat in Chad. And the way he told the story of Hub was that he'd killed so many Africans in Chad. I mean, he'd flown low enough to see them die in close air-ground support. And the idea of it set heavy on his Gallic head. There was something about the utter mismatch of a Mirage jet against a mob of AK-wielding North Africans that put a malaise on his mind. And when his service was done, he took his combat bonus pay and bought a single-engine prop airplane. And in the manner of Saint-Exupéry, he puddle jumped all over Africa, from the north down to the south and then back up the other coast. He spent about a year or more trying to know Africa as something other than war and killing. When his Wanderjahr wound down, he filled the fuselage with extra fuel and flew the plane back from Africa to Paris. He then disassembled the plane in a hangar and bought a little bar in Montmartre. He made the bar where you sit out of a long aluminum wing, and behind the bar was the beautifully turned propeller, and to hold up the top shelf liquor, he installed the entire tail wing assembly like a crucifix on the wall, where sat the cognac and the rare rums, backlit beautifully by a subtle orange light. And in the glass case by the front of the door stood a debauched store mannequin, dressed in his Mirage combat flight suit, decorated by several dozen hats and beads and leis that had been brought from all over the world by various Air France flight crews who had found this bar and called it their Paris layover watering hole. One of his airline friends had told the patron about a vintage Air France 707 that was going off to the barnyard in Toulouse. It was the original jet airplane, Kennedy, a model that ushered in the jet age of the early 60s. And so he bought all the interior trimmings for a song and set them up in the back as a lounge, and you could lean back in your jet seat and watch the video projections of music videos from MTV Friends or jet airplane porn, where the plane would turn over like a beautiful woman and show you its belly, the smoke coming out its eyes. It was a nice place to lounge around intimately with new friends, or the flight crews, or the pretty stewardesses, or just the regulars, and we order pizza from down the street, and fold down the flight trays, and eat, and take a break from the serious business of drinking, and talking, and smoking. And it was a nice place to sleep if you forgot to the night before. The illusion of flying in an airliner had this magical effect of suspending time and space. You would enter the lounge as you might a fuselage, as you would meet people and watch movies and have cocktails, and then sleep as if on a journey, and you would awake again in the morning or in the late evening, as if you landed anew in Paris, and the patron would greet you, and you would say, which translates more or less as, how's your body? Strong. And so Paris would wake up again, and the city would spin around the hub, and the propeller would propel you out the door and down the hill to whatever happens next. Now, one of the mad things I was doing in Paris was writing the screenplay of the story you just saw. And it was loosely based on Ulysses in a novel I started writing in Paris when I was 16 called Heroes. The characters of Heroes were named Phil and Niz, or Zed. Zed started as a French punk rocker, We sort of circled the Americans, Phil, like a wolf, as Phil circled the heroin.